Hi everyone, Emmerron here. Today, I have something very special for you all. I got an early review copy of Cyberpunk RED's single player mode from Artel Sorian, and oh boy, there's some stuff in here that I want to talk about with all of you. A massive thank you to all of my subscribers on Twitch, as well as my patrons over on patreon.com. If you would like to join me in making the best content that I can, please consider joining at the link down below. Thank you all. Now, back to the video. So, let's begin. First of all, this is everything that I wanted in a product like this from a solo version of the rule set. Not to bury the lead entirely, but I think that there are tools in here that every GM is going to want, regardless of if you're running this for your table regularly or if you are indeed playing it as a solo RPG. So let's talk about exactly kind of how this thing is distributed, where the contents are. So for about the first 30 pages or so, you're going to be looking at the solo mode itself and how that handles. For those of you who have played single player or solo RPGs in the past, this should feel relatively familiar as it did for me. I know a little while ago I played the solo version of Dragonbane on this channel. I'll put a link up here if I can remember it. But that solo mode was very much dependent on dice tables and random chance for questions which you, the player, wouldn't have an answer to intrinsically. And so in the single player mode of Cyberpunk, they refer to that process of consulting role to table. They called that the Oracle. So the Oracle is very much something that we will use repeatedly. There are times where that is going to require just a little bit of interpretation in terms of things like verbs or adjectives that give some directionality to the way that you are resolving something, but it doesn't always have to feel like that. It just will occasionally take that bit of imagination. The good news is it does a lot for you. It spells out a lot of things, and it makes it incredibly easy to use as a solo RPG. In order to properly illustrate this point, I want to read an example from the text itself that I think does a pretty excellent job of detailing this. Peter is sitting down for the beginning of a Cyberpunk RED solo play campaign. He's decided to center it on the Sightseers, a nomad pack operating out of Night City that specializes in the transport of small goods and people. He begins with a basic premise created by rolling on a few random tables. The Sightseers were hired by a fixer to smuggle goods from a day market to the fixer's office. It went off without a hitch. Well, almost without a hitch. The Sightseers' youngest member, Swirl, has a bit of a problem with keeping her hands off of other people's belongings. Peter realized during the mission that Swirl might be tempted to take a few extra pieces of contraband for herself. He decided the DV for Swirl to focus on the job and not the shiny loot was a 15. He rolls a d10, adds Swirl's will plus concentration, and comes up with a 14 total. Swirl helps herself to a handful of goods. Starting a new session, Peter has to ask himself a question. Did the client notice that some of the items were missing? He consults the Oracle and decides that the probability is likely the client does have a manifest after all. He rolls a d100 for 45. Not only yes, but yes with a complication. Needing more inspiration, Peter first rolls on the People of Night City tables to determine who paid the fixer to set up the job. He receives the answer, a local cop. Then he consults the beat chart. Where should the new adventure begin? For a hook, he rolls play a cliffhanger. Today's session is starting off right in the action. Peter doesn't bother with rolling the actual cliffhanger because it all clicks into place in his head. A cop named Sergeant Titus Sarge Malloy had arranged for the smuggling job, and he was unhappy about the missing goods. He trumped up charges for the arrest of the Sightseers, then sent one of his subordinates, charmingly known as Pitbull, out with a few other cops to effect an arrest. Peter quickly adds Sarge and Pitbull to his NPC tracker form ensuring that he'll remember them in future sessions. So as this example illustrates already pretty clearly, I think, this system is going to use a lot of forms, a lot of tables. Some of them are going to be role tables. Other things here are going to be more like trackers or things of that general nature and vibe that will make remembering things a little easier. And also it's the sort of note-taking devices that you as a GM, if you were running the game for a group, are going to want to have anyway. So honestly, this is, all things considered, exactly what you'd want. Now, as we talk about that, I do want to point out what I think is the true treasure in the middle of there, right? Because like I said, about the first 30 pages are going to pretty much entirely be your procedure and rules for solo mode as a solo RPG. But the true charm of this is that in there with everything else, there is about 70 pages worth of tables. So there are 106 total pages in this book, and of them, only 30 are concerned with solo mode rules. The entirety of that remainder are going to be vastly, in the majority, role tables, and the last 12 are reserved for forms and sheets that honestly could be useful for you even in your average Cyberpunk game. So let's talk about that a little bit now, because I think that is why every GM, regardless of the type of game that you are running, is going to want to have a copy of this handy. If not at the table during play, though you very well may want that too, definitely during prep, because it simplifies so many of those elements that I feel like I spend a ton of time laboriously prepping and thinking about and self-scrutinizing. And by the end of it, I am somewhat exhausted, and this kind of takes all of the really hard thinking away, and it just leaves you with seeds for really good ideas. So ultimately, this is something that I feel like we've needed for a while. I know I mentioned a couple weeks ago on Wireheads that the supplement, which is a third-party supplement, Augmented Reality, was something that kind of stood in for this, and it kind of incompletely filled the gap that we're missing with this. But this now kind of fixes that gap in a more perfect way, because all of these role tables have the right names, they have the right places, they have all the right flavor. This is Cyberpunk's version of almost entirely that. About the only thing that Augmented Reality covers that currently we do not have a supplement for that is like explicitly there is a city builder. And I have to imagine there will be elements of that which are included in NC 2045 when that drops. So I look forward to seeing what that looks like if we do get those tools then. But what we do have here is honestly so much of what bogs me down. There are name tables, there are random things tables, there are some tables that have been recycled into this from the core rulebook, from other supplements, from DLCs. There are even a list of DLCs at the front of this book that they explain you may want this if you are playing solo mode. And I would say that those things are just as useful even if you're running a full game. So I would take the recommended DLC list here. They include things like Dating in the Dark Future, Night City Weather, things that have a few more of those role tables. You could also consider, I don't know if it was listed in that list, but Toggle's Temple is another one that has some role tables for you naming random weapons and building them. So if you did want to have that available to you, that is another thing you could stack on top of everything they've already mentioned here. They are free for the DLC portion of that at least. So highly recommend looking into those if you have not already at your table. But this just tacks all of that together, makes it very referenceable. And the couple of places where it doesn't, they're much longer, more comprehensive things like the gun path or the date path from Dating in the Dark Future. And the weather roll tables are a couple of extras that honestly you could print out like a one-pager and you'll get pretty much all of the details minus some strange weather effects that you could then reference at your table. If you have Interface Red Volume 2, I believe you should also already have that DLC in your collection. So have a look at that if you own a physical copy of that book. Beyond all of that, though, this is something that we have needed for a minute. I think my favorite thing, which I will put up on the screen here as a sample, we now have random things tables for the random objects that some gonk or corpo or even another edge runner that you flatlined on the street might have in their pockets. So these can be some really random things, like I think one of the corporate ones was half a box of condoms. Another that we see is like a cred stick loaded with a very specific amount of eddies. Very useful stuff overall. So combining this with some of the name charts I mentioned earlier and some of the forms even that we get, there's like an IP tracker that you could use as a sort of ledger. I know that when I'm running games in a virtual tabletop, I typically run in Foundry, as those of you who've watched Neon Inferno will know. Those things are features of that tabletop that I love and that I feel like we have had to do a much more meticulous job of kind of building for ourselves at a physical table before this has come out. And now that we have like an actual form that lets us do that, obviously it's intended to make simplifying IP ledger stuff for a ton of different characters in solo mode easier, but we can also use it at a typical game as a GM to mark, I gave this number of IP to everyone. So if someone asks the next week when they bring their character sheet to the table and say, oh, GM, I'm so sorry, but I forgot to write down the IP we got last week. How much was it? You can either have handed them a sheet like this and then reference your own to say, I gave everyone 80 IP last week, or then they have a ledger and they can know whether or not they added that into their total and just forgot. It makes all of that much easier. There are also some NPC frames that we've gotten in the past, which are mainly things that we've seen in books like Tales of the Red, Hope Reborn, and this gives us blanks for those with a couple of new inclusions, such as blanks to describe someone's personality quirks, their appearance, some things that interest them, so you can build more fleshed out NPCs just by having that at your disposal. So ultimately, I think what I've said thus far, I think does a pretty good job of illustrating why this is such an important thing to have at your table. It's an important thing for you to implement with all of your players and everything. And that is simply because what we've got here is a thing that we did not have previously. We have a bunch of random roll tables that build out the world more easily for us. We've needed this so that GMs have more of that pick up and play ability with the game that I think, just kind of been lacking since the core rules first dropped. And this kind of really fills a large part of that gap. And it shortens the need for you to have things like a fantasy name generator on another tab, or have a bunch of random names yourself already printed out on a list. You now have both of those things. And so I would get this. I would highly recommend every GM out there, when this drops, we've been told that it is slated to drop either late September, so that's this month, or early October. So in the next 4 or 5 weeks, roughly, we can expect that this will come out. And when it does, everyone should get a copy of this. Even if you are a GM for a standard table and you don't see yourself rolling up a solo campaign of your own, this serves as an awesome tool for the reference tables alone, to say nothing of what it also gives you the power to do if you want to play out an arc in a character's life path. So like, if you want to play out an arc in one of your NPC's life paths to see like, how did we get here? What might their motivations be? Now you have a tool to do that. You also have rules in here. One of the things I haven't talked about yet is you have rules for truncating combat and net running. So if you, like me, have had a situation at your table where you wanted a nice granular little net run or combat because the scene on screen matters in the context of all of that. Like, there are things that could have happened in that thing that bleed over into your current scenario, but you were like, I don't really want to run a full-scale combat or net run in the background with NPCs being all the combatants. Now you can do that. You just truncate this either during or before the combat that you're running into, and lo and behold, you have all of the granularity you need to see how the NPC force fought, and if they won, if they died, if something else happened. You have all of that now at your disposal with this. So I think that ultimately, while it is titled single player mode, this honestly should just be called the Cyberpunk RED GM Toolkit, because that's kind of what it feels like when you take this paired with all of the stuff we've gotten in the core rulebook or on the data screen. You've got just about everything you'd ever need to run Cyberpunk RED at a moment's notice. If your players throw you off track, there are things in here like mission tables and scene tables and all of that sort of stuff to get you comfortable again and bring you back into a place where you know what's going on and the players and you are having a great time. So ultimately, I would say get this immediately the moment that we see it drop. It is going to be available as a PDF on DriveThruRPG. We've also been told that it will be available as print on demand when it comes out. So for those of you who are physical media nerds like I am, I could recommend honestly getting it either way. I think having a copy of this handy at your physical table is going to be well worth the price. With all that said, that's about it for me for today. So I hope all of you have a wonderful morning, evening, or afternoon, wherever you are in the world. Stay healthy, stay safe. Till next time, peace.